Our next speaker, Patrick Schroeder, will discuss some of the most notable points of his books, 30 Myths About Lee's Surrender and More Myths About Lee's Surrender. He will explore what really happened at Appomattox, separating fact from fiction. Patrick Schroeder holds a Bachelor's of Science in Historical Park Administration from Shepherd's College in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. He has a master's degree in Civil War history from Virginia Tech. Patrick has written, edited, and contributed to more than 25 Civil War titles, including The Confederate Cemetery at Appomattox, Recollections and Reminiscence of Old Appomattox, Tar Heels, Sailor's Creek, General Curtis Lee's Capture with Controversy, and Civil War Soldier Life in Camp and Battle. Patrick has worked as an independent researcher, author, historian, and tour guide. He resides in Lynchburg, Virginia, and serves as a historian at Appomattox Courthouse National Historical Park since 2002. Please join me in welcoming Patrick Schroeder.
Thanks for coming out today. It's an honor and privilege to be here and speak to you folks and tell you a little bit about Appomattox or discuss Appomattox. I do have some Gettysburg connections. I had a Civil War cousin that was killed here 153 years ago today with the 120th New York. His brother, and his name was Edward Ketchum. His brother John Ketchum with the 4th New York Cavalry buried him on the battlefield. And they were known as the Fighting Quakers because they were of the Quaker faith, but they believed that slavery, the evil of slavery superseded being a pacifist. So they both joined the army, and unfortunately both of them died during the war. His brother was later captured and died in Libby prison. Also my pet regiment, I'm originally from Utica, New York, and my hometown regiment is the 146th New York Zouaves, and they fought up on Little Round Top. So if you go up there and visit General G.K. Warren and you look down to the right, there's the monument to the 146th New York. So they're my pet regiment. Now, how many of you folks have visited Appomattox Courthouse at some point? Good, more than half the people. Great. Well, all those that haven't visited us, you need to come pay us a visit. And everyone that has visited us in the past, you need to come back. Because with the 150th last year, we've got quite a bit of stuff in on loan, on display relating to the surrender. We've added quite a few displays. The village, we restored the village. First massive restoration of the village since the 1950s, 60s. So come back and see us. When people come to Appomattox, they usually say, wow, we didn't know there was so much to do here, because you could really spend all day at the park, especially in the summer with the ranger programs and the living history talk. So do come back and pay us a visit. When you think about it, a lot of people look at Gettysburg as the beginning of the end. Right? But the end comes nearly 2 years later at Appomattox Courthouse, which is about a 5-hour car drive south of here if you go down 15 and then take a right. So if you have the intuition to come to Appomattox, please do pay us a visit. And when I say the surrender took place at Appomattox Courthouse, one of the things we typically have to explain to visitors when they come in is that Appomattox Courthouse is a town. Courthouse being 2 words, capital C, capital H, that's the town. In Virginia, each county had a county seat, and it was called Courthouse. So surrounding Appomattox Courthouse, there's Buckingham Courthouse, Charlotte Courthouse, Prince Edward Courthouse, and Buckingham Courthouse. Towns. Now they do have a courthouse building, but if you're talking about the building, it would be 1 word, courthouse. All right, so the surrender took place at Appomattox Courthouse, but it didn't take place in the courthouse, if you're following me. It is confusing. The surrender took place in the home of Wilmer McLean in the village of Appomattox Courthouse. So I think there are probably more myths and misunderstandings about Appomattox than any other place I personally know, perhaps even more than Gettysburg. And what I started doing back in my college days, I started writing down the stories people would come through Appomattox and tell us that weren't true. And so I eventually developed that into 2 little books where I tell what the myth is and then what really happened. And I did 30 Myths, a book called 30 Myths About Lee's Surrender, and then I did a second little book called More Myths About Lee's Surrender, and there's 52 myths in those books. There's, of course, more stories people have told me over the years, but I haven't compiled them into another book yet. And if I ever do that, we'll call it Even More Myths About Lee's Surrender, okay? But what I'm going to focus on, I mean, the stories are great. They get passed down from generation to generation. But what I'm going to do is tell you some of those stories and what's not true about them. After General Grant heard some of these stories later in life, he said, "Wars produce many stories of fiction, some of which are told until believed to be true." And I think you will find that the case. And later, when he was asked about giving General Lee back his sword, which didn't happen, he said, "I, for one, never believed those stories." So U.S. Grant was all in favor of dispelling myths. How did these stories even start? Well, some of the stories started right there in April of 1865 with the soldiers themselves. They didn't witness the event, but they heard about it, and they passed along the information that wasn't correct, and it grew from there. If you think about it, some of you probably remember that schoolroom game we used to play where you would start a story over here, and you would pass it along around the room, and if it got to the back of the room, it was a completely different story than the one that started at the front of the room. And that happened right there in 1865. Sometimes it's journalists and reporters. They don't have a full understanding of the events at Appomattox. They go back home, they write their story, and they put it in print. And once something's in print, people believe it to be true. Sometimes it's historians ourselves. They don't research the topic properly, or they tend to slant their information to make their point better or carry their point. And sometimes they just borrow from other sources. And sometimes it's our fault, just our failure to understand the way life was in 1865. And also the military operated differently than it does today. And then there is just the fact that people prefer the romantic version. They like that story. Keep your sword, General, even though it never happened. People like that story. So now you may not believe, or you probably have a better understanding than a lot of the visitors, but these are some of the things we typically hear. People come to the park, they want to tell you something. They want to show you that they know something, and many people will throw out something like this. We'll start with the two main characters. They'll say, "You know, Lee and Grant were classmates at West Point, but Lee and Grant were not classmates at West Point. Lee was 16 years older than Grant. At the time of the surrender, Robert E. Lee was 58 years old, and Ulysses Grant was 42. Interestingly enough, both men died at age 63, but 16 years apart. Lee attended the United States Military Academy at West Point from 1825 to 1829, and Grant attended from 1839 to 1843. And while we're on the subject of Robert E. Lee, people will typically tell us something like this. "Well, you know, Lee finished first in his class at West Point." But Lee did not finish first in his class at West Point. Do any of you know who finished first in that class? Somebody? That's right, Charles Mason. Yeah, you probably read my book, didn't you? Yeah, it's Charles Mason. And the reason you never heard of him is because after his couple years of service, after 2 years of service, he left the Army. He was from upstate New York, but he went out to settle in Wisconsin, and there he became a patent lawyer. He taught engineering and later became the first Supreme Court Justice of Iowa. So he did go on to make a name for himself, but not in the military world. So Lee finished second in his class. Now, often, I used to tell people this myself, that Lee graduated with no demerits. And that's true. But there were 6 other cadets in that class that also graduated with no demerits. Now, Grant finished 21st in the class of 39. He was a noted excellent horseman. And one of the things I heard, I used to do living history at Appomattox, and if any of you folks that have been there, we typically run our programs from the Clover Hill Tavern porch, a building that was built in 1819. And there were displays inside. And back in my college days, I could hear people talking in the building. And I heard one visitor say, well, Ulysses Simpson Grant, that wasn't his real name. He changed his name. And they were right about that. But then he said, I think his name was Jerome. But he was never Jerome Grant. He was born Hiram Ulysses Grant. But he went by, like so many people did in the Civil War time period, he went by his middle name, Ulysses, rather than Hiram. Just like Ambrose Powell Hill of the Confederate Army went by Powell Hill, he went by Ulysses Grant. Thing is, when his congressman got him enrolled at West Point, he only knew him as Ulysses Grant and didn't have a middle name for him, so he gave Grant Simpson as his mother's maiden name, his middle name. So when Grant gets to West Point, the name they have on the rolls is not Hiram Ulysses Grant, but Ulysses Simpson Grant. And so he goes ahead and adopts that name at West Point. And it's very fitting because he becomes U.S. Grant, or Uncle Sam Grant. How much more appropriate can that be for him later in life? Interestingly enough, his family gave him a chest to take his personal belongings to West Point, and they put his initials in brass tacks on top of that chest. So when he left home, it said H-U-G, hug. You know what Grant did with those brass tacks? He took them off, exactly. Yeah, he didn't want to get to West Point and have the other cadets start calling him Hug or Huggy Grant. Could you imagine if that name stuck? And at Appomattox, General Robert E. Lee would have surrendered to Huggy Grant? That just wouldn't be right, would it? Now, the Appomattox Campaign is a very interesting, intriguing campaign because it's very different than the Gettysburg Campaign. You have, from April 2nd through April 9th, the armies cover over 100 miles in a straight line. It's 100 miles. But when you look at a campaign map, these guys are marching north, south, and ultimately west. So they cover probably closer to 200 miles during that week, and they're fighting engagements every day. But they are not big battles like Gettysburg or Antietam. They're small actions, smaller actions for strategic positions, holding roads, things like that. The largest battle of the campaign is at a place called Sailor's Creek. And there Lee loses somewhere over 8,000 men, killed and wounded, but mostly captured. And in many books you will read that Lee lost half of his army at Sailor's Creek, or Lee lost a third of his army at Sailor's Creek. But it's not true. He did suffer significant losses, not only 8,000 plus men, he also lost 8 generals in that engagement, including his eldest son, Custis Lee, who was captured. But when he reaches Appomattox, we have what's called the parole list, all the Confederate soldiers that physically receive a parole pass to go home after the surrender. And there's 28,231 men on that parole list. And about 2,400 Confederate cavalry escaped Appomattox. Nearly 2,000 men were captured on April 8th. So when you put the numbers together, you're looking somewhere between 32 and 35,000 men. And if you add 8,000 to that, that's roughly 40,000 men. Now, I'm much better at history than I am at math, but if you lose 8,000 out of 40,000 men, that's about 1/5 to me. So Lee didn't lose half or a third of his army at Sailor's Creek. He did lose a fifth. Now, interestingly enough, after these losses at Sailor's Creek on April 6th, you might think that it was General Grant that first asked Lee to surrender, but it wasn't. It was William Nelson Pendleton, Lee's chief of artillery at that time, that proposed surrender. He said he had a council with high-ranking Confederate officers, and they felt they should lift the burden from Lee's shoulders if he wished to surrender. And he goes to General Lee and tells him what these other officers think, and Lee responds around noon on April 7th to General Pendleton, I hope it hasn't come to that. We must all determine to die at our posts. So on April 7th, Lee is still ready to fight his army to the end, to the death if necessary. So when does Grant first ask Lee to surrender? Well, it's later that day, about 5 o'clock, and he's at what becomes it's the Randolph House, later the Prince Edward Hotel in Farmville. Lee has suffered these terrible casualties, lost a fifth of his army, but what really sparks Grant is he meets Dr. Smith. Now, Dr. Smith was a surgeon in the United States Army. His cousin was General Richard Ewell of the Confederate Army, and after he was captured at the battles of Sailor's Creek, Smith happened to meet Ewell, his cousin. They talked, and Ewell said that he thought Lee would surrender. Of course, Ewell has a Gettysburg tie here, too. He said he thought Lee would surrender if Grant asked him to. So at 5 o'clock, General Grant sits down and writes a letter asking General Lee to surrender his army. It passes through the lines, very dangerous. Several couriers, orderlies get killed passing these messages through the lines. The message reaches Lee at about 9 o'clock. He reads the note from Grant asking for a surrender, and he hands it to his right-hand man. And his right-hand man is General Pete Longstreet. Longstreet reads the note from Grant and responds. Do you know what he responds? Not yet. Not yet. So he's not ready to surrender the army yet. But Lee uses this opportunity to write Grant and find out what kind of terms he will receive. Because who's he dealing with? Unconditional surrender Grant. Exactly. This is a smart crowd. Unconditional surrender Grant. Is Grant going to demand unconditional surrender? That's what Lee needs to find out. And when Grant writes back, he spells out that he will not ask for unconditional surrender. He will be rather generous in his terms. But that opens a 3-day correspondence. Most people don't know that General Lee and General Grant corresponded for three days before the surrender. Now, when you come down to Appomattox, people often think that, well, Lee must have been going for Lynchburg because Lynchburg's the next town of any size about 25 miles away. So he must have been going for Lynchburg, but he wasn't. He was trying to get to North Carolina. In North Carolina, General Joseph Johnston had an army somewhere around 30,000 men. So the idea is if Lee, with all his troops from Richmond, Petersburg, Bermuda 100, the clerks and everybody, somewhere around 60,000 men can get south to link up with Joe Johnston, they might have 80 or 90,000 men. They can try and take on Sherman, hopefully deal him a blow, turn back and fight Grant with better odds. Pretty long hopes to do that, but that was really their only choice. So the Appomattox Campaign really develops with Lee trying to, once he concentrates his army at a place called Amelia Courthouse, he's going to try turning south. But see, that's where Grant does things a little bit different than other previous Union generals. He gets in blocking position so Lee cannot turn south. So every time Lee goes south, he's blocked and has to go further west, and eventually ends up at Appomattox Courthouse. But even when he got to Appomattox, he intended to go through a present-day town called Rustburg, historically Campbell Courthouse, which is about 8 miles south of Lynchburg, and then head down to Danville and into North Carolina. So he never intended to come to Appomattox Courthouse. People come in the visitor center and say, why did Lee come all the way out here to surrender? Lee didn't come to Appomattox to surrender. He didn't know he was going to end up there. In fact, when you look at Lee's headquarters maps over there in Harrisburg at the Civil War Museum there, Appomattox isn't even on those maps. What's on those maps are the counties along the Richmond-Danville Railroad, the route he was going to go to North Carolina. Now, when people come to Appomattox, they know about the surrender. And the National Park Service itself perpetuated the story that Appomattox was a place of peace, a surrender site. This is where the war ends. Very little talk about the battles at Appomattox Courthouse on April 8th and April 9th. Now, we didn't have a Battle of Gettysburg, we didn't have a Chancellorsville or Fredericksburg, but you had some more of that strategic fighting making for very unique battles. On April 8th, the Confederates are trying to get to Appomattox Station where there's supply trains that have been brought over for Lynchburg. somewhere 180,000 to 300,000 rations, ammunition, fodder for the animals, new uniforms, blankets, everything the Army needs to continue this campaign to link up with Joe Johnston is waiting at Appomattox Station, which is a separate place about 3 miles west from Appomattox Courthouse. Now, the Federals used some devious means in this campaign. They dress in Confederate uniforms and infiltrate the Confederate Army. In the Shenandoah Valley, they call them Jesse Scouts. In this campaign, I typically call them Young Scouts, Major Henry Young's Scouts. These men could affect Southern dialect. They would infiltrate the Confederate Army, posing as Confederate cavalrymen, turn wagons down the wrong road, tell them to unhitch their mules, cause bottlenecks, things like that. Well, one of these men are scouting over near Appomattox Station and finds out that the supplies are coming from Lynchburg on these trains. He rides back to General Sheridan. Sheridan turns to his right-hand man, who was a young brigadier general here at Gettysburg at Appomattox. He's 25 years old, but commands a division of cavalry and is a brevet major general. I saw you mouth it. Yes, George Armstrong Custer. His division advances on Appomattox Station and captures those supplies. He then runs into the Confederate Reserve Artillery. General Reuben Lindsay Walker has about 100 artillery pieces, but no infantry support. And shortly after 4 o'clock, about 4:30, commences the Battle of Appomattox Station. A very unique battle of the Civil War. Some of these artillerymen have muskets with them, but it's primarily mounted Federal cavalry attacking unsupported Confederate artillery in a 4-hour engagement. So a very unique battle. I've never been able to place any other Civil War engagement that has mounted cavalry against unsupported artillery. So Custer's men, of course, they're advancing through these woods. They don't find it very, it's a terrible area to fight a battle because the cavalry have to come through the woods. They tend to funnel into these trails, and when they come out, they come into an area where Walkers have got about 30 guns into a semicircle, and they start hammering Custer's cavalry with canister. And of course, you don't have to necessarily kill a cavalryman to take him out of action, at least temporarily. Just take out his horse, right? 1st West Virginia Cavalry claimed they lost half their horses in that engagement. So every time Custer has a brigade come in, he launches an attack. 3 attacks are repulsed. It's now dark. It's about 8 o'clock. He has all 3 brigades on hand. He launches an attack, overruns those 30 artillery pieces, capturing about 25 guns. He captures the Confederate hospital trains. 1 regiment, the 15th New York Cavalry, charges into the village of Appomattox Courthouse, 2-3 miles away, and they run into Lee's army that has gone into camp in the Appomattox River Valley. Lieutenant Colonel Augusta Root of the 15th New York Cavalry is killed, and that ends the fighting on the evening of April 8th. The cavalry fall back to the ridge west of town, and they send a brigade up to relieve it under General Charles Smith. Now that night, General Lee holds a council of war at his headquarters with General Longstreet, General John Gordon, and Fitzhugh Lee, who commands his cavalry. That is General Lee's nephew. He does have 3 sons that were serving with the Army, but Fitzhugh Lee is his nephew. They think they can break out because it must only be Federal cavalry that could get that far ahead of them. So on the morning of April 9th, General Gordon's 2nd Corps makes an assault to the west to open the road. And they are initially successful in opening the road. But Federal infantry of the 24th Corps, John Gibbon, who was wounded here on July 3rd, over there where they repulsed Pickett's charge, is in command of the 24th Corps. He has 2 divisions of white troops, and then he has a division of United States colored troops that has been attached to him. Those men, on April 8th, cover anywhere between 30 and 35 miles in 20 hours of marching. That's probably the most incredible feat of marching during the war. And then they get up and march some more on the morning of April 9th to come up and support the cavalry. And when that Federal infantry appears on the road, the Richmond-Lynchburg Stage Road, the Confederates knew that the game was over, really, because if they were going to have to engage infantry, they just would not have enough force to push through. And the Federals pushed the Confederates back into the Appomattox River Valley, and that's when the white flags come out. Again, it's not at Gettysburg or a battle of like nature, But there's somewhere 800 men killed on April 8th and April 9th in those two engagements. Another 2,000 Confederate soldiers captured. So we're talking somewhere 2,000 to 3,000 men in those fights at Appomattox Courthouse. The thing is, most people never even heard about that fighting. And I think it's probably the most tragic thing is to die on April 8th or April 9th, 1865. And they did. One Confederate soldier, Jesse Hutchins, he enlisted April 15th, 1861. You look at his service records, he's present throughout the entire war, and he's killed April 8th, 1865. There was another soldier, color bearer of the 14th Virginia Cavalry. His name was James Wilson. He is shot in the battle on the morning of April 9th. His friend William Moffett, after the surrender takes place, goes out to find out what happened to his friend Wilson, and he finds him out on the battlefield. And what Wilson says to Moffett just makes tears come to my eyes, because Wilson says to Moffett, he knows the surrender's taken place, but he knows he's been wounded so bad that he's going to die. He says, Moffett, it's hard to die now that the war's over. And he died. All right, so you know a little bit about the engagements at Appomattox Courthouse. Do you know we had a Jenny Wade at Appomattox? I bet you didn't. So you all know about the Jenny Wade here at Gettysburg. We had a civilian fatality at Appomattox. Her name was Hannah Reynolds. She was a slave of the Coleman family. And during the fighting on the morning of April 9th, a Confederate artillery shell passed through the house where she was. She had stayed behind. The family left, but she stayed behind. And the artillery shell struck her in the arm. They took her to federal surgeons. A surgeon from the 8th Maine Infantry worked on her. In fact, one account says she was treated with as much attention as they would a major general. But they did not save her life. She died 2 days later. But interestingly to note, there's a record of her death of April 12th. It notes that she's a free woman. Because think about it. When she's hit with that artillery shell, she's not free. But once that surrender takes place, the Emancipation Proclamation is in effect in Appomattox County and really throughout Virginia. And she is a free woman, even though she passes away. Now, I used to love to watch stuff like on A&E when they had history programs, or the History Channel when they had history programs, right? The good old days. Well, I saw one program, and they had a historian on there. He was very enamored with Custer, and he said, well, Custer did this, and Custer did that, and that's why Custer received the surrender flag at Appomattox. That's why I said, well, time out, I'll start writing more myths about Lee's surrender, right? Now, Custer did receive a truce flag, and it was the first truce flag, but about a dozen truce flags went out to various points of the line because that line stretched several miles long. Now, Custer was over on the Federal right flank. His cavalry was getting ready to pounce into the Appomattox River Valley. They were in a very strategic position. But it is not like the Confederates looked and said, oh gosh, here comes Custer, we better send out a surrender flag in that direction. They didn't have any idea who it was coming down that way. So he did receive a truce flag. It was the first truce flag. It is now on display in our Visitor Center Museum. But multiple truce flags went out along the lines. Now, one of the lost cause stories, and it still gets perpetuated today, is that Lee only had 10,000 men when he surrendered at Appomattox. And you will see that, no matter what you do, you see that number, and it's absolutely untrue. We know, because there is that parole list that enumerates 28,231 Confederate soldiers that received their parole passes to go home from Appomattox. Where do they get this number? They get this number from a letter that Lee sent to Jefferson Davis saying that he had to surrender. He could only put 10,000 men into battle. He later revises the number to 25,000, but if you want to make the odds seem more drastic, more severe, you will seize on that 10,000, kind of forget Lee later says 25,000, and use that. Now, Lee was outnumbered. Grant had about 65,000 men at Appomattox, so he was outnumbered 2 to 1. but he had about 3 times as many as 10,000 men. One of the interesting things we often see at Appomattox or hear is, who was the last soldier to die, who fired the last shot, and you go through just about every regiment that was there. If they wrote a regimental history, they will claim to have fired the last shot or had the last man killed at Appomattox. And most of them, I would say typically just about all of them, are not true because they don't know, these soldiers that are with the infantry don't know that there's a cavalry action about 3 miles away, because Fitzhugh Lee, General Lee's nephew with the cavalry, when they find out there's going to be a surrender, they don't want to surrender because they don't know what's going to happen to them. For all they know, they may go to prison camp and they'll lose their horses. So Fitz Lee takes about 2,400 cavalry, tries to escape to the west. Well, Federal cavalry is watching these guys ride off to the north and west. When they hit the Richmond-Lynchburg stage road about 3 miles away, they go to fighting. Now there's a Walmart there. So we call it the Battle of Walmart, right? Historically, it was the Robertson House. And they actually charge and countercharge. There are men killed and wounded in that fighting. And, we don't know who bled out and died last. So there's multiple men that could have been the last fatalities, but that's where the last shots are. Fortunately, they did pay. With Civil War trails, I was able to get 2 wayside exhibits put up there, so we paid tribute to men that were killed and wounded in that last fighting. That was at about 11 o'clock in the morning, and the fighting back in the village ended somewhere between 10 and 10:30. So the Robertson House Walmart fight was where the last fighting occurred. Now, I'll go back there and tell you, just tie it in with one of those myths. When I was telling you about Hannah, the civilian that was killed, the slave woman, we had a journalist from the Atlanta Journal come through this early 1990s before we used internet and relied on that. He came to Appomattox, saw the story about Hannah, found it intriguing, went back and wrote this article about how Hannah Reynolds was the only person killed at Appomattox. Well, apparently it intrigued him so much because he didn't even look at the battle display that was right next to it. The thing is, he went back to Atlanta, wrote this article about the only person killed at Appomattox was Hannah Reynolds, and that went out to millions of readers. So as far as they knew, there was only one person killed at Appomattox, the unfortunate Hannah Reynolds. So that's one of those ways these myths get started. But the original myth of Appomattox, are you ready for it? Is that Lee surrendered under an apple tree. Yep. You know how that started? With the soldiers themselves. See, because General Lee and General Grant were corresponding for 3 days. On the morning of April 9th, Lee gets a message from John Gordon that he has fought his corps to a frazzle, and I cannot go forward without the support of Longstreet. Well, Longstreet's 4 miles to the rear facing the Federal 2nd and 6th Corps. Longstreet can't help Gordon. And Lee says he must go meet with General Grant, even though he'd rather die 1,000 deaths, surrender the army. So he sends a message to General Grant that he wishes to surrender the army. Grant at that time is changing fronts. He is with General Meade that morning, and he writes a note to, well, they had corresponded the night before and that morning as well. But as far as Grant knows, Lee is not going to surrender on April 9th. It's going to be a day of battle. And what Grant wants to do is change his headquarters from Meade, who was following behind Lee, to the front, which is being led by Sheridan, the 5th Corps, and the Army of the James under General Ord with John Gibbon. So he goes on this 22-mile ride to get to Sheridan, and in the meantime, Lee gets this note from General Gordon. So the messenger has to be sent to catch up with General Grant. I'd estimate maybe 11 miles into this 22-mile ride. And when Grant reads a note from General Lee saying he wishes to meet to surrender the army, Grant had been suffering with a terrible headache. He said that headache instantly disappeared. But Grant has with him a headquarters company and several cavalry regiments of escort. 3rd West Virginia Cavalry, at least part of it. My estimate is he had an entourage of about 200 men riding with him. Of course, you're not going to go out there as a commanding general and just search for a way to get through the lines. He sends Lieutenant Colonel Orville Babcock and Lieutenant William McKee Dunn to find General Lee and give Grant's response about having a meeting. So Orville Babcock and Lieutenant Dunn set out. They get passed through the lines. They find General Lee resting, even sleeping, under an apple tree by the Appomattox River. The thing is, behind General Lee is where General Gordon has reformed his men, General Mahone has formed, General E.P. Alexander's artillery has been sent over there to support them, and they all see this Union officer talk to General Lee under this apple tree. Lee later rides to the village shortly thereafter. When he comes back, they learn that they've been surrendered. So mistakenly, they assumed that Lee surrendered to Grant under an apple tree. And that news spread. So American soldiers have always loved to collect souvenirs. Those Confederate soldiers went over there and started cutting down that apple tree. Once the fighting stopped, Federal soldiers started to come through the lines, curious to get a look at the Confederates. They see a bunch of them gathered around this tree, chopping it down. They say, "Johnny, why are you cutting down that tree?" They say, "This is where General Lee surrendered to General Grant." They say, "I want a piece of that tree too." By that night, they cut all the branches off, they cut down the tree, they dug up the roots. There was nothing but a hole in the ground. And soldiers took away pieces of the apple tree from where Lee surrendered. And so that myth got spread because Confederate soldiers on the way home, they said hungry Confederates would go up to a house and they'd say, "I've got a piece of the apple tree where Lee surrendered. Can I have something to eat?" And so that myth spread. The Union soldiers spread that myth. A lot of soldiers thought that Lee surrendered under an apple tree. It's not largely dispelled until Grant's memoirs come out after his death. It's interesting, too, because as a kid, I used to love to listen to Paul Harvey and the rest of the story. And I always loved to hear the rest of the story, but now I call into question anything I ever heard from Paul Harvey before he passed away. Because at one time he did this story and said that the surrender at Appomattox really happened under an apple tree because he had this soldier's letter. But that wasn't true. So people often say, well, why didn't they use the courthouse? Well, the courthouse was closed. It was Palm Sunday. Union troops got into the courthouse. They could have gotten into the courthouse if they wanted to, but Grant instructed Lee to find a suitable place to meet. And Lee sent Colonel Charles Marshall into the village to find a private residence. And in the village, he ran into a fellow named Wilmer McLean. Okay, here's one of the myths, two myths. One is, and I see it posted all the time and in books, that it's Wilbur McLean, W-I-L-B-U-R. He didn't have a talking horse named Mr. Ed. Wilmer, W-I-L-M-E-R, Wilmer McLean. Now say Farmer McLean. McLean's not a farmer. Okay, where does that come from? His wife had a plantation in Manassas. She was a widower. But McLean ran a wholesale and retail grocery business in Alexandria before he marries the widow. So they're there at the time of the Battle of First Manassas, Bull Run. Actually, they've rented the house out in the outbuildings to the Confederate Army. They aren't physically at the house. Of course, this is the Battle of Second Manassas, Second Bull Run. And then he goes to Appomattox. Now, you'll see, in the Ken Burns series and all that, they tell you the story that Wilmer McLean told people. I left Manassas to escape the war and came to Appomattox, and the war found me again. Poor old me. Do you feel sorry for me? He told people that all the time. What he didn't tell people was that he made somewhere between $40,000 and $90,000 Confederate money in sugar speculation during the war. He was a war profiteer. Of course, all that money on April 9th was worth nothing. But he would offer to sell you his autograph for $1. So, don't feel too sorry about Wilmer McLean, okay? I'm not saying he wasn't a nice guy. Everybody seemed to like him. But he did have money. It seemed to be the center. His wife the widower was very wealthy when he married her. Anyways, not Wilbur, Wilmer McLean. Now, interestingly enough, Most people don't realize that Meade still commanded the Army of the Potomac at Appomattox. People always think it's, well, Grant commanded the Army of the Potomac. Well, he did because he commanded all the armies of the United States. He was overseeing the operations of 3 armies at the time of Appomattox, personally overseeing the operation of the Army of the James, the Army of the Shenandoah. The Army of the James is under General Ord. Army of the Shenandoah is under Wesley Merritt, but Sheridan commands all the cavalry. Army of the Shenandoah has 2 divisions of cavalry. And then the Army of the Potomac, which is still commanded by General Meade. So Meade is still with the Army at Appomattox. Grant is just over top of it. Now, one of the things you typically get is you read in all the books, and we typically say it ourselves, the soldier said it, is the surrender at Appomattox ended the war. Now, to us, the war really comes to an end at Appomattox because there are no major battles after the fighting at Appomattox. Could have been. Fortunately, there wasn't. And all the other Confederate armies that surrender received the same terms that Lee received at Appomattox. But Lee is the beginning of the end. His surrender on April 9th is the first surrender. Joe Johnston surrenders 2 weeks later in North Carolina on April 26th. He surrenders the 30,000-man army he has with him, but he surrenders all the troops in North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and parts of Florida. When you total all that up, there was somewhere between 80 and 90,000 men. So that is the largest surrender of the Civil War. May 4th, Richard Taylor surrenders the troops in Louisiana and Alabama. And then Kirby Smith surrenders, after some negotiation in New Orleans, surrenders in Texas, officially on June 2nd. So that is the last surrender of a Confederate army, okay? Don't say, oh, don't forget about Stan Wadey. But Stan Wadey didn't command an army. We're talking about army surrenders. Now, the last Confederate force to surrender was not infantry. It was a ship, the Confederate raider, the Shenandoah, and that doesn't surrender till November 6th, 1865 in Liverpool, England. They had been out sinking whaling vessels off what became the state of Alaska, Bering Strait, and they thought that they would be tried as pirates if they surrendered, so they circumnavigated the globe and surrendered in Liverpool, England on November 6th. The way I look at it is that the Confederate Navy was saving whales in 1865. Last thing I'll wrap up with here, and then we'll throw it open to some questions, because I could go on all day with these myth stories, but when people come to the village of Appomattox Courthouse today, they'll say, oh, you did a great job reconstructing this village. Isn't this awesome? Most of the buildings are original, but they've been restored. Some needed more restoration than others. The 2 buildings they rebuilt, the main buildings they rebuilt, was the courthouse, which is now our visitor center. It looks historic on the outside, but inside we have our museum and theater. That burned down in 1892. It was reconstructed in 1964. The Mclean House is an interesting story. It is dismantled in 1893. Now, people will often say, oh, it was dismantled. They were going to send it to the Columbian Exposition, the World Fair in Chicago, and put it on display there. Not true. Not true at all. They tried to sell it to them up there, but they didn't have an interest in it because they already bought Libby Prison and John Brown's Fort and moved it up there. They were averaging 11 visitors a week. They weren't making any money on that. So they didn't want to buy the Mclean House and move it to Chicago. So it was proposed, but it was never acted upon. So it was a group of Union veterans that came in. They bought the house. They were going to make a retirement community at Appomattox for Civil War soldiers. This is where veterans could come and live. And that never took off either. So they decided to dismantle the house and move it to Washington, D.C., where they could make it into a Civil War museum, and many more people would see it in Washington than would ever come to Appomattox. They take the house down in 1893, and there's a financial panic in the stock market, and the company, the firm that is dismantling it, goes bankrupt after they took the house apart. So the house just sat out in the yard. People would come by, take bricks home as souvenirs. The wood rotted away. And so when the Park Service takes over from the War Department, they determine their main goal will be to reconstruct the Mclean House. Of course, World War II intervenes. So they stop. They've done all the archaeology, but they haven't started rebuilding it. After World War II, they go at it with a will. They finish it late in 1948. They open it up for visitation in 1949. And in 1950, they have the dedication, I think on April 16th, 1950. They have Robert E. Lee, Ulysses S. Grant III, and Robert E. Lee IV come cut the ribbon. So that's when the house is, and they got the original plans from the company that dismantled it, so they were able to reconstruct it the way it looked in 1865. They also used, there were 5,500 original bricks still on site that could be used in the reconstruction. They put those on the front of the house, so when you walk up into the door, you are passing through the bricks that were there in 1865. Now, so the furniture, that all went with the generals. People say they stole it. Not true. Sheridan gave $20 in gold for Grant's table, which is now at the Smithsonian. Lee's table, General Ord bought for $40 in gold. That's at the Chicago Historical Society, which changed their name to something else a year or two ago. And I will wrap up with something that's not in my books. It's just interesting. I think you might find intriguing is people think that the Civil War happened in the Stone Age. They couldn't communicate back then. I tell you, when you read letters from soldiers in camp back home, I think the mail ran better back then than it does today. You will get correspondence from a soldier in camp to New York and back within a week. Excellent. But Grant strung up telegraph with him throughout the campaign. And after the surrender at the Mclean House, Grant comes out about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. 4 o'clock, he sends a telegraph message to Washington, D.C., letting them know that Lee surrendered. And from Washington, it arrives at 9 o'clock. It goes out throughout the North. Most of the cities in the Northeast find out the night of April 9th that Lee surrendered that day. And so it goes out very quickly. A couple days later, they are printing all the correspondence between Lee and Grant in the newspaper in San Francisco, California, within 5 days. I was doing research at the National Archives, not even related to Appomattox. I was going through a soldier's pension file. He'd been a prisoner of war. He'd been exchanged. He gets to visit, he's a Union soldier. He gets to Vicksburg on April 10th, writes his parents a letter to let them know that he's all right. And in that letter on April 10th in Vicksburg, Mississippi, he says, "We learned Lee surrendered yesterday," in Vicksburg, Mississippi. So the news gets out very quickly. So it got out very quickly. Now, areas telegraph isn't, takes longer, but Confederate soldiers carry word with them when they go home. All right, got time for a few questions here? Thank you.
Was Robert Lincoln at the surrender ceremony?
Very good question, and yes, Robert Lincoln was at the surrender ceremony. In the room, yes. Robert Lincoln was the son of Abraham Lincoln. He had joined the Army, I think, early March of 1865 on General Grant's staff. Of course, his mother did not want him to join the Army after losing several children, very protective of him. Robert felt he needed to do his duty. And Abraham Lincoln gave him his blessing, told Grant that he would pay for Robert's salary and so forth. Grant said no, he's a fine young man. He had just graduated from Harvard, and Grant took him on his staff. So he was with Grant's staff in March and April 1865. He's on the porch, comes into the room for a time when Grant is introducing his staff to him. The interesting thing is, when he leaves with Grant on April 10th, they get to Washington on April 14th. That morning, he has breakfast with his father. And that night, his father is assassinated. So, undoubtedly, they would have discussed the events at Appomattox before his assassination. In fact, Robert was invited to go to the theater that night, but he said he was too tired after this rigorous campaign. Question in the... Oh, over here, sorry.
I actually have two questions,
Sure,
if you
go
don't mind. The first question is, I read in some books and magazines where that Grant had, in total of those three armies, about 80 to 120,000 men. And the second question is, there was another thing I read where Jeff Davis said to Lee, if all else fails, disband the army, send them into the mountains so we can fight for 20 or 30 years as almost like a Viet Cong kind of thing.
Yeah, the two questions are that, trying to think back to the first one. What was your first question again? I'm sorry. Oh, Grant between 80 and 120,000 men. Yeah, at the that's another one of those things that distorts the numbers, because physically present within a 10-mile radius of Appomattox, about 65,000 men. But you see, he had troops that went into Richmond and occupied Richmond, the Army of the James, division from the 24th Corps, 2 from the 25th Corps. He had troops occupy Petersburg. He had the 9th Corps detailed the relay track on the railroad because it was a different gauge, and if he needed to bring supplies, it would have to be the federal gauge to get those cars to him. So they were detailed more than 30 miles away. So yes, those numbers, 100 to 120,000, are in the Union armies in Virginia, but physically at Appomattox was about 65,000. So with the Civil War numbers, you can always twist them to how you want it to portray what you're trying to get across. Second question now was Lee, what Jefferson Davis told Lee to continue the fight, guerrilla warfare. And that actually was brought up also by E.P. Alexander, artilleryman here under Longstreet that bombards the federal lines before Pickett and Pettigrew's charge. And when E.P. Alexander mentions that to Lee, he says, you young men may go bushwhacking, but the only honorable course for me is to see General Grant. So Lee did not look at bushwhacking as a sustainable way to see their cause to victory. Also, people often ask us about that at Appomattox, and what I found interesting is that it is not General Gordon or General Longstreet, the infantrymen that are fighting physically with the enemy. It's an artilleryman that is firing from the rear that suggests they should scatter and go to the mountains. Even so, Lee estimated that, he said, how many men would get away? Maybe a third. So it wouldn't be a great deal of men. And Lee thought that that would bring war to other parts of the state that would not be visited by the armies. So he did not look at it as an honorable thing to do. In fact, Joe Johnston does the same thing when Jefferson Davis tells him to keep fighting. Davis leaves. Johnston opens talks with Sherman to surrender his army. So it just wasn't really feasible for them. That's not how Civil War armies fought. They could have done it, but it would have just added to the destruction of the country. Lee saw that his men would have no way to supply themselves with arms, ammunition, or food, and that they would raid the people of the South to get that stuff. So, back here.
Yeah, with General Meade being commander of the Army of the Potomac, is there any known reason why he was not asked to be at the surrender ceremony?
Yes. Why was General? And if Andy Waskey's watching this, we had a talk about this at a Civil War roundtable where he presented the views of General Meade. I like Meade. There just was no reason that he needed to be there. Of course, when Grant leaves Meade that morning, they have coffee together. He leaves Meade, and he has no idea the surrender is going to take place. When he gets to where the surrender takes place, had gone on a 20-mile ride to get there. If Meade he doesn't need Meade. All he needs is his staff, and that's who's in the room. Any of those paintings you see where Custer's in the room? No, Custer's not there. General Grant's staff's in the room. He doesn't need Meade there. It would have been nice, but he doesn't need Meade for this meeting. What would they have to do to get Meade there? They'd have to pass him through the Confederate Army to get him to the Mclean House. Grant doesn't need him. Passing them through the Army is really impractical. I guess it could have been done, but I don't think they wanted to wait. Last thing I think General Lee wanted to do is sit around waiting for other people to come to this meeting. Let's just say, though, Grant gets in that room and says, we're not going to parole your men. Terms he gave them were very generous. Going to parole them and allow them to go home. Lets officers keep their sidearms, personal baggage. Men that own horses could take them home with them. But let's just say Grant has a change of heart. No, we're going to send all your men to prison camp. Lee says, well, we're going back to fighting. Meade's in that room. How do you get Meade back to the Army of the Potomac? So it just wasn't really practical. In the end, it would have been nice, but he wasn't needed there. All right, let's check time. We got one more question here. Or two. We'll do these 2 questions, then we'll wrap it up.
Is it true Eli Parker told Lee we're all Americans now?
According to Ely Parker, yes, he did. We don't have any way to dispute that. It is a very feel-good thing. Ely Parker, for those of you that don't know, was a Seneca Indian chief on General Grant's staff. He actually wrote out the final letter to Lee for the surrender terms. Beautiful penmanship. They said he had the best penmanship in the Army. That original copy is at Stratford Hall, Lee's boyhood home. They loaned it to the Park Service last year. We had it on display for a year. We have a copy of it now. But he's a Seneca Indian chief, and Grant introduces his staff to Lee. And Parker said that when he was introduced to Lee, Lee said, "It's good to see one real American here." And Parker responded, "General, we're all Americans." So, and that's true. I mean, the soldiers north and south, they were all Americans. It was a coming together of the country again. It's going to be a difficult road, but we were all Americans. So we can't deny that. I never seen anybody deny it, but other than what Parker says, we can't substantiate it. You know, all the people, if you could go into a time machine, go back in time, I think probably most people here, I'd go to Gettysburg. I'd go to the Mclean House on April 9th from 1:30 to 3 o'clock that afternoon, because you know what? You know what we have written down? Transpires in about 15 minutes maybe. They were in there an hour and a half. I'd love to hear all the things that were said in that room, but we don't know. There was one more question here, and we'll wrap it up.
If you can think back to last year at your park and share some thoughts with us about how you thought that all went. You must have worked for years and years and years towards that commemoration.
Oh, the commemoration.
So, right. So just sort of share with us your thoughts about all of that.
Yeah, about a year and a half ago, we had our 150th event. It was a concluding event for the 150th for the National Park Service. Went extremely well. We did have a lot of preparation. It rained every night, but it didn't rain during the day. Got a real feeling. The neatest thing about April 9th, 2015 was the morning of April 9th, got up at 4 o'clock that morning. I think I had a radio interview at 6. But when we went out that morning, it was foggy. And it was foggy the April 9th, 1865. So it just raised the hair on the back of your head. So, and they did a battle demonstration, and the smoke hung low, and so you could actually get a feeling of what it was like in April 1865. And like I said, it wasn't a reenactment, it was just a demonstration, but when the Confederate troops started to fall back and the Union troops were coming over the ridge, we could see a United States flag, but you couldn't see the troops, and that was pretty neat. We had descendants of Ely Parker, Charles Marshall, and General Grant were present for the events, and everything went as well as any event could be expected. And we also did a thing called Footsteps of Freedom. In the evening, we worked with the local African American community and had the funeral service for Hannah Reynolds, the lady that was killed. And then we lit the village with luminaries, with about 4,500 luminaries to represent the 4,500 African Americans that were freed because of the surrender at Appomattox. So I could talk about Appomattox all day. I'd love to talk with you some more. I'm going to go in here and sign my books if you have an interest. They're small books, inexpensive. I think they also brought some of my books on the 146 New York Zouaves that fought on Little Round Top, and the Pennsylvania Bucktails, a photographic album book that I did with photos from Ron Palm's collection. So please stop in and see me. Thank you.